Whether you're a mom and pop organization or you're trying to do immunizations around the world, change is change. And one of the most effective vehicles is to tap into the narrative itself.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, a podcast from IPM Advancement. Our mission is to help you raise more money so you can make the world a better place. Today's topic, breaking down barriers to change. One of the biggest challenges a nonprofit can face in advancing their mission is convincing people to change their behavior. Whether that's recipients of your services, people in the community, lawmakers, donors, or even people working within your organization itself, your approach to communicating your message will determine how effective your nonprofit can be. Hi, I'm Curtis Schmidt, host of today's episode of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. I'm here with IPM consultant Josh Gryniewicz, a narrative strategist. I love that term. And we're planning to dig deep into some really fascinating work that Josh does with nonprofits. Josh has a background in psychology, social work, public interest communications, and creative writing. These days, his passion is helping nonprofits and social change organizations build an effective narrative framework to advance their disruptive stories. We'll also hear later from Ricardo Cobe Williams, founder and executive director of Interrupt the Violence. Josh and Cobe have been working together in some exciting and innovative ways that illustrate the power of this process of narrative framework and story mapping. Josh, welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Curtis. I appreciate it, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
And for getting through my last name. That's no easy feat.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you about the work that you do because I think it's really game-changing for a lot of organizations. So let me ask you to describe what it is you do, because these words that you use, like narrative framework or disruptive storytelling, they might not necessarily mean too much to listeners right now. So I want to give them kind of a high-level explanation of what you mean when you say that you do those things.
As you said, I consider myself a narrative strategist. I have my own consultancy, Odd Duck, and then I do, for IPM Advancement, I do narrative strategy work as well on behalf of clients. We work with an organization, partner with an organization, an agency. It can be anything from a kind of storefront community-based organization to a tech startup doing something in the health and wellness space, to the United Way. And what we like to do is determine what is the disruptive story, the paradigm shifting story that this organization is trying to tell and the change that they're trying to make. And then how do we actually, once we've identified that story, how do we build a narrative framework so that we can better assert and insert that story, that shift, into the broader dialogue and the public discourse, or the public narrative, if you will. And so that's the work that, in all humility, that I'm trying to do day in, day out on behalf of our clients.
Great.
Culture change is not easy.
Yeah. And we're going to share some great examples of the success you've had using that narrative framework to help organizations. Before we go there, I wanted to ask you, what kind of led you into this? Is it something you studied, or was there an evolution in your journey where you discovered, hey, this is really the way to communicate organizational stories to create behavior change and impact?
I was actually probably about 10 to 12 years ago. I was working for a public health initiative that was doing a lot of really game-changing, paradigm-shifting work on the ground in communities, specifically in Chicagoland, but looking to expand nationally. And part of that was contingent on an independent evaluation that was conducted with 4 universities throughout all of the communities in Chicagoland that we were working. And it demonstrated as much as a 68% reduction in community violence and other factors. So we had expected, Curtis, that cities would be knocking at our door. Oh my God, I can't believe you achieved these results in some of the most hardest hit and most disadvantaged communities. Please come here, implement your model in our city, implement your model in our community. This is a problem that we've been working on for decades, and you have a solution, not the solution, but a solution to this. And so, it was like the evaluation came out, 4 years of study, boom, it's released. Everybody held their breath, and it was like
crickets.
Yeah. So we were like, okay, what's going on here? Why aren't we getting traction? Now, at the same time that this, and again, this is not like a small evaluation. This is like 200 some pages, 300 some pages. At the same time, there was a documentary film that was conducted primarily about 3 of the workers who were on the front line of some of this community changing work, some of the norm changing work. So the film actually premiered in Sundance, had a theatrical release throughout the country, played some 200 theaters throughout the country, and actually ended up on PBS. But here's the thing, Curtis, what ended up happening is everything we expected to happen with the evaluation suddenly happened with the film. And this was not something that dove into the actual logistics of the model. It is not something that dove into how these components worked or the demonstrated effectiveness of it. This was really a story about 3 individuals who happened to be employees of this organization who were making effective change on the ground in their communities. And that's what resonated with people. And so for me, that was the scales falling from my eyes, aha, wake up moment where I was like, there is something going on here. Like, how is it that everything we expected to happen with the data is now happening with the film itself? And flash forward, we're now like, there's now close to 100 sites worldwide, 25 cities, let alone, community sites. And so the entire model has been, it just like, it amplified and kind of exploded. And for me, it was game changing in the sense that I went, okay, there is something to this storytelling piece, and I want to learn everything that I can about it. So my self-study was I dove into public health examples of soap operas in South Africa that were actually having an impact on the HIV/AIDS rate. I was looking at comic books in Kenya that were actually helping to teach young people who had been urbanized how to go back to traditional ways of farming, and again, some violence prevention components. I was looking at TV series that were actually having real world social impact. And so I was studying all of that on my own through my health communications lens. And then I went back to grad school to actually go into the creative writing program and absorb as much as I could from the creative writing program to learn about literature and all of those pieces. My undergrad was in psychology. So, this was the opportunity, Curtis, to bring those 2 pieces together, to bring my 2 passions together, storytelling and social change. And, this was what kind of fused them. And so flash forward, and now I've been working with organizations around the country and really throughout the world to help them kind of shape their narrative framework and get their disruptive story into the broader discourse.
Yeah, so interesting, that we tend to think that data is the definitive word. The data is in. Now we change, right? But what you're saying is it's the data is not wrapped in a story that speaks to the audience, it won't affect change. People might have, on an intellectual level, they might go, oh, yeah, that says I shouldn't do this. Okay. But they don't actually follow through with their behavior.
Actually, Curtis, that's fantastic that you pointed that out, because research has actually indicated that a fact is up to 22 times more likely to be remembered and recollected when it's framed within a story than on the surface alone. And other research has looked at massive social events, and we could use COVID as a perfect example, that is so difficult for the average media consumer to actually get their heads around these large numbers, infection rates, or even the number of deaths, But when you drill all of this statistically down to actual individual stories to show the impact of those stats, that is going to resonate with audiences far more than the statistics or the numbers themselves.
So let's say I'm at a nonprofit organization. I'm an executive director or somebody. I'm probably not sitting there going, you know what we need? We need help with our narrative framework.
Yeah.
So what kinds of problems would I be having? How would things be going wrong in my organization where I would identify that I might need to seek out your help?
What I like to say is that narrative is a vehicle for change in any context. So whether you're a ma community-based organization, or you're trying to do immunizations around the country or around the world, change is change. And one of the most effective vehicles, not the only vehicle, but one of the most effective vehicles in actually facilitating that transformation is to tap into the narrative itself. And so, in answer to your question, it's, and that's why I use the term disruptive story so often. It's an organization that has or is trying to tell a disruptive story, often landing on deaf ears, often not getting a lot of traction in the story or the change that they're trying to facilitate or make.
Can you give a quick example? Because I like the point that you're making there, but just want to give listeners something concrete. Sure. So what's an example of an organization with a disruptive story they're trying to tell?
Yeah, I had the opportunity to work with Institute for Juvenile Research based here in Chicago, a 100-year-old organization. But one of the initiatives that they were working on was specifically around community-based mental health for kids of all ages. So it was grade school kids, teens, adolescents, all the way through into their 20s. And they had all of these programs that were essentially around leveraging the sort of touch points in these youth's lives, in these children's lives, for mental health and mental wellness promotion, rather than just focusing on a clinical setting where the kid has to come into an environment where they may not feel comfortable, sit across from a person, make eye contact with them, open up and talk about things and make themselves feel vulnerable. It's much more effective to have that happen in the classroom or in the playground or so on.
So that's the disruption, this traditional way of interacting with the kids, disrupting that idea with, hey, maybe there are better ways we can connect with them and communicate.
That's exactly it. That is the disruptive story. So now the bigger challenge, or the challenge where we would be tasked, or I would be tasked to come in as a narrative strategist, is to find out, okay, what is the story? What are we trying to do here? And how do we start shifting the way people are thinking about mental health and thinking about mental wellness in a way that this seems like a viable option? And that's exactly what we did. And we ended up building a campaign website out of this.
One quick follow-up question I have, because I think this is really interesting, this idea of disrupting the story and changing the way people think about certain things. From what I understand, that work is done externally, like in the community, but also internally within the organization, because you've got a lot of biases that are really behind kind of, why things have been stuck the same way for so long. Is that correct?
Yes, actually, thank you I would actually say I've worked with several organizations, and this is how I came to some of these conclusions, where I would be brought in to do some branding or rebranding work, with these organizations, and they would say, well, we've checked every box. We've changed the color scheme. We've even changed the name. We've got everything's ready to go. We just need to flip the switch. Could you come in and help flip that switch? And then it would be like, well, what is the story that this new brand is trying to tell? How is that carrying within the organization? So how are people feeling? Because until I started doing brand work, I had never really considered the depths with which people identify with brands, with logos, especially those who are working day in, day out, pulling all-nighters on behalf of an organization. When you start talking about a name change and changing an identity, it almost it does. become like a personal affront sometimes to some staff and some team. It's like, well, I've been doing this for 10 years, and who do you think you are, coming in and changing everything? And so really what I found, and this is a discovery, was that the change is more manageable and more palatable to teams when they buy into the story. And so that was the piece that it was like, oh, there's a place for narrative here, which is what led to developing the entire narrative framework in the first place. There's a place for narrative here. And actually, narrative is absolutely 100% critical to effectively making these transformations within an organization.
Interesting. So there's a close relationship between changing your narrative and changing the organization to align with that narrative.
That's right. I mean, I like to say everybody from the receptionist on up to, the executive director should be telling the same story with every encounter that they have for the organization. And we're talking, honestly, Curtis, we're talking beyond just an elevator pitch or, a few talking points. We're actually talking about having buy-in on a narrative itself and being able to articulate that story that kind of advances the change that the agency or organization is trying to make in the world.
Hi, this is Curtis from IPM Advancement jumping in for a moment. If you're a nonprofit professional who has questions about your program, or maybe you feel like you've taken your advocacy, fundraising, or membership effort as far as you can and you need some fresh ideas, we have a special offer for you today. NPFX podcast listeners can get a free 30-minute consultation with IPM, no strings attached, when you go to ipmadvancement.com/free. Just enter a few details and an IPM team member will contact you to follow up. It's that easy. That website again is ipmadvancement.com/free. Thanks for listening, and we hope to talk to you soon. Now let's return to the episode. We wanted to have another guest on the podcast, somebody you've worked with named Ricardo Williams. He runs an organization called Interrupt the Violence, which does some amazing transformative work in communities around the country and around the world. He's a very busy guy, so you actually had a one-on-one conversation with him earlier in the week. And we're going to play that for listeners in a moment. But to set that up, I thought maybe we could use the work that you've done with Interrupt the Violence as an example to describe the process that you use when an organization brings you in to help with their narrative framework.
Yeah, this was back in March 2020 when, everything was going into lockdown. And Interrupt the Violence is a community engagement organization. They're primarily focused on violence and on the ground. They're national, so they have a pretty broad reach. But they really focus on communities, primarily communities of color that have been disenfranchised and are dealing with excessive levels of violence and, often marginalized. Ricardo is very effective at, the engagement piece, at bringing in community members. But when everything was sort of kicking off and we were going into lockdown and we were trying to figure out ways where we could get some of the safety protocols and the health guidelines that the CDC was putting forward, that the World Health Organization was putting forward, and get more adoption in the communities where ITV, where Interrupt the Violence was working, it was beyond the community engagement aspect. And they had kind of looped me in to figure out sort of how do we identify the messages that will be most effective with this audience.
Because the traditional messages that they were getting from, healthcare organizations were not resonating. That was the issue.
Actually, thank you for that. That's an important point to clarify. For hundreds of years of legitimate reasons, the Black and brown communities were very distrustful of the medical establishment. and of the formal government establishment itself. So the messages weren't getting through for a number of, again, legitimate reasons having to do with trust that was broken and never formally reestablished. And the second point, I just want to make sure that I clarify for the listeners that none of this is about, in any way, shape, or form, blaming the patient or blaming the victim. And I do not want to leave any listener with belief that, this is somehow the community's fault, or that it is the result of them not adopting these practices, that they're to blame. And so we went in saying, okay, aside from the disconnect in trust, what are some of the barriers that, these audiences, that these community members are having to the adoption? So the trust is a huge one. That's the elephant in the room. But what are some of the other barriers that are being encountered? One of them we found, Curtis, was that when, African-American males were being asked to put on a mask, they felt that it was making them a target for law enforcement, and, again, there's legitimacy there. This is not just a perception issue. Putting on the mask was more threatening for them, for their safety, or for their well-being in many ways and in many contexts as the virus itself. But where we were able to reach them with the messaging is, okay, the mask poses a threat to you, but not wearing the mask means that you could be transmitting this and bringing this home to grandma. It means that you could be bringing it home to your girlfriend or your wife. It means that you could be bringing it home to your baby, or your kids, or spreading it among your friends. And so that action of not wearing the mask is a risk that you're taking on behalf of all of your loved ones.
Yeah. So this is an interview between Josh and Ricardo, also known as Cobe Williams, the founder and executive director of Interrupt the Violence.
Cobe, thank you so much for making the time to talk to us and to connect with me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. No problem.
So just to start off, I thought you might want to kind of introduce who you are and then talk a little bit about, some of the work that you've done, both in the community, nationally and then internationally.
Yes. Thank you for having me. My name is Ricardo Williams, but everybody call me Cobe. So Cobe is my nickname. Yes, I work ever since I came home from prison. I got into this type of work in over 20-some years. So I'm in this field of violence prevention, changing community norms. And I'm so happy to be doing what I'm doing every single day. And when I say violence prevention, I do a lot of traveling all over the world where I train people, community engagement, all different things, how to make their community safe. Not just make their community safe. I have trained people making their household safe. That focus on changing their mindset, changing their behavior, letting them understand that violence is a learned behavior, but it can be changed and slowed down when you hire the right people to interrupt this transmission of this violence inside the home and outside the home and at schools and everywhere else.
Awesome.
Yeah, so interrupt the violence, something I started years and years ago. And it's something that needed to be started, though. And when I say it's needed, I know what helped me coming up as a youth, a young man or a kid or whatever you want to call it. I knew what helped me because what you see out here is a lot of people coming from broken homes, and I could relate to that. My father was murdered when I was 11 years old, but he was in prison. Once he had came home from prison, he ended up got killed by his so-called friends. And coming up in my neighborhood, that's where we was taught violence at an early age. I remember my father, when I used to go see him in Stateville. At the time, that's one of the first max penitentiaries around. I used to go see my father, and his friends used to be in the visit room teaching me how to throw up signs. And when I say signs, I mean gang signs as a kid. So as a kid, that's who I wanted to be like my father, and that's where I became like my father.
And now your ITV, Interrupt the Violence, actually does, all of that sort of like positive mentor. You mentioned
Yes.
changing cultural norms. Last month, March, Cobe, when COVID had sort of first hit, violence interrupters like yourself and others, really pivoted their role from what is usually like a conflict mediation position to sort of being first responders on the front lines of the pandemic. And looking in on the elderly and providing masks, because at the time, I mean, there was obviously a mask shortage at the time, and so you were instrumental in getting masks into prisons. You were instrumental in getting masks.
Yes, we got thousands of masks into the Cook County Jail. Yes,
I think that's one of those undertold stories in this pandemic that really needs to be shared. And I would love to hear your experiences with that specifically.
Yeah. So one of the things, so when this pandemic hit, it hit hard. So as it took a toll on the community, it put us in an awkward position because we always dealing with a lot of violence, right? So it was a little tricky situation because we want to educate people about stop the shooting and stop the killing, but we also want to educate people about wearing a mask, washing your hands, keeping hand sanitized. I was on a block in my neighborhood, about 20 guys out there, they shooting dice and hanging up, and nobody got no mask. So I pop the trunk and stop popping a mask. I keep masks in the car just because of that. If you could see in my car right now, I got masks in the front, back seat, the back, the trunk, everything, because I want to make sure people are taking it serious. So it was difficult too, because when we doing mediations and all that, we gathering around. So we had to do a lot of intervening in cars. And so guess what? I'll be like in the middle, in the center, then I have somebody on the other side, and they car and somebody on the other side. That's how we had to do it like that, because we want to make sure that we stay 6 feet. We right there with each other, but it still was like long distance mediations. But that educating them in that wellness. So that's why we started passing out a lot of posters, making all type of public material and different things like that to educate the community and everybody. So that was a good thing to do, making videos and different things like that. Because we wanted people in these communities to take this stuff serious though. And then a lot of my friends, yes, they are my friends. I love them dearly. I was in jail for different cases and different things like that. Definitely in Cook County Jail, prison, and all that. They had reached out to me while they was in there, say, "Man, we dying in here, man. We ain't gonna die. Only thing we gonna make it home and all that. We ain't got no masks in there." So what I did, one of my good close friends, Joaquin Noah, used to be the star for the Chicago Bulls, and he do a lot of community great things in the community. He donated at least about 20 or 30,000 masks. It could have been a little more than that, but he did a lot of that. What made him do it? Because I was just telling him my people are dying and they calling me, bro. And he said, "Man, no, enough said." So I put him in tune with the right people, and he made it happen. I salute him because they needed that. So I'm just saying the work never stopped. Whatever you're doing in this field, the work didn't stop. But you got to definitely keep educating the people about awareness of the virus out here and the violence still out here. And so that's why we focus on changing the community norm as a whole. We want to keep educating. We got to continue to produce new pub ed material, public education for these people, and making videos and just educating them so they'll know, man, this is serious. I mean, I just lost my mama last month. My mama just passed for COVID. She had COVID. So I just lost my mama to this. So I'm definitely on this campaign to take it serious and all that. I got a lot of friends who don't believe in wearing masks and none of that, but they get tired of me like, "Man, Kobe, come on now, Kobe, come on now." But I'm gonna keep pushing them with it because I know it's serious, man. It's been affecting people and all that, but it hit home when it really hit my mama. So
I'm really sorry for your loss.
I think one of the biggest things too is it got to be the right people pushing this though too. And when I'm saying the right people, I'm saying it's people knowing like, man, he wearing one, Kobe wearing one, I'm gonna wear one. Kobe never told me nothing wrong. Kobe never did nothing wrong to me. Kobe always just tried to help me. So the messenger, and when I'm saying that, I ain't just saying myself. I'm just saying the messengers who have influence, and I'm talking about who have influence and they use it in the right way.
Right.
So it was easy to get the campaign out there because people listen and look up to certain people in these communities, right? So that was good.
Cobe, you're very strategic in how you find relationships and partnerships that, you know, are going to have influence. This is one of those things that I've been wowed by seeing you in action. Can you talk a little bit about how you find these right messengers and these right partners?
I mean, sometimes a lot of people reach out, they follow the movement, and they want to know how the movement been working and all that. That's one way a lot of people reach out. Then you have a chance to talk to them on the phone, sit down and talk with them in person, see where they coming from, and being able to go through the community with them, seeing who they know. That's one way. Then a lot of times, on a humble note, know a lot of people all over the world, so the networking is strong. So when somebody reach out to this place, that place, like, man, I know people over there. I know somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody. So when people know somebody and know somebody, man, we need to be able to get them to the table. So when you bring all these brothers and sisters to the table, you could pre-screen them and see where they coming from. You could pre-screen them and talk to them, and you could walk the neighborhoods with them and see how people respond to them.
Right.
So once I see how people respond to them, like, okay, they know the neighborhood. People respect them. Right. So that's important to have the right credible people who trying to be a part of what you're doing and all that, because if you don't have the right ones, things could backfire you too.
I'm glad you kind of broke all of that down, because I think there's a tendency of being like, oh, I'm an organization going into, such and such a community, and I'm going to partner with a local community-based organization. I'll just work with whoever they provide. And one of the things that I'm hearing you say, and that, again, that I've seen in action, is it's not just about, taking people at their word or but really kind of walking along with them into the community and seeing their interactions firsthand, because that's where you actually get a read of how well they're actually connected and relating to the community.
No, definitely. I mean, it takes skills for this,
right? Because
you got to know how to vet the right people,
right?
You got to know how to communicate, So it take a lot, though.
That's absolutely right. And one of the things that you've kind of mentioned is, doing this public education piece. And that's one of the things that you and I kind of partnered on a little bit last March was, figuring out PubEd. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about both what goes into PubEd and specifically what went into PubEd with that, and what you've seen kind of as effective, social norm change work.
So we let the people who sit down with us be a part of this. And I'm talking about not so much of the messengers, but the people in the community. Yeah. And let them help come up with some of the slogans, and let them help out. What you think about this? What you think about that? So what they're able to do, we bring them in, then they'll bring other people in, then they'll bring the youth in. Then now you could go home and ask grandmothers and grandfathers and different people what y'all think and all that. So it's a whole big campaign, but it got to start with the top and get the right people all the way down to the bottom with it. So it was a great thing, and it turned out great, but it needs to be heard out there.
You're based in Chicago, but you work all over the place. And so first, this campaign was Chicago, it was Philadelphia, it was Baltimore, New York.
Yeah, it was all over though. Yes.
Right. And so the messaging is going to be a little bit different in each of those cities and each of those communities. So that's the first thing, is by creating the avenues for the community to be self-directed in that messaging, really allowed it to have all of those local characters. And you mentioned one of the things too that was really effective was having the youth come in and kind of respond to the messages, give feedback and stuff like that. And I specifically remember that some of the messages that were strongest were like, remember, you're bringing this home to your girl, you're bringing this home to your grandma, you're bringing this home to, and that really resonated with people and came directly out of some of these responses. So I just wanted to highlight those two pieces, because I think that's so important. It's it really is about the community directing these messages and taking ownership.
Right. But that's why it's important, though, to have the community involved, though, with everything.
Right.
When you think about a campaign, you got to have the community as a whole involved with this campaign.
100%. 100%.
You can't leave nobody out. So it just makes sense if I'm traveling all over the world with these places, these locations, these cities, states, just all over. It's important to let their voice be heard too in their community. So sometimes you got to equip people with tools they could use that's going to benefit their community.
That's right. Because there's always like this tendency to sort of craft the message and make sure that we're saying things right. And one of the things that I learned from this experience is like just, having to kind of take a back seat to that and like take in all of this information, all of the feedback, everything that folks had to say, to make sure that again, the message was being directed by the community. I've said this before, but I am really glad you're doing what you do. I am so honored to know you and to have an opportunity to work with you, Cobe, and you are absolutely a personal hero of mine. So I keep doing what you're doing, and thank you very much.
Definitely appreciate it. Likewise, I appreciate that.
Is there anything that you want to add to this conversation, or?
We're not there yet.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that, it still a lot of work need to be done. And we still need to keep the conversation going. Yeah. We still got to be thinking when we sleeping. We need to be thinking while we sleeping.
Yeah.
What we can do more of, what we could do better, how we could educate more people, how you could get the word constantly stay out in a different way. You can't talk about this today and don't talk about it tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next week and all that.
Right.
You have to keep the conversation going somehow and educate much people you can. And always remember, do not give up.
Thank you.
I really, really love that interview. And thank you for doing that. I wish we could have had Cobe on the podcast here to actually talk to the three of us. But I think he made so many great points. And what he was talking about at the end there, my interpretation was that it's about a really deep, deep level of understanding a community's needs. He said, we need to be thinking while we sleep. And I'm taking away from that the idea that disruption is only going to come from people who are immersed, whether it's somebody like Cobe who lives and breathes the work. I saw an interview with him where he talked about how interrupters are on call 24/7. So it requires that, but it also requires input from the people actually in the communities and listening and understanding what connects with them and what doesn't and why and all that kind of stuff. That paradigm shifts really come from listening, from new information about your audience or any of the stakeholders. New information about them is really what allows you to be more effective.
That's absolutely right. Another thing in the interview that he was talking about and that he's talked about elsewhere in presentations is talking about the right messenger and the right message. Mm-hmm. So that's a common mistake that is made within social work and community-based organizations to this day. Yeah. It's like, with the best intentions, I can go anywhere and do anything. And I'm not trying to say, you should be excluded from that, but I'm saying that there needs to be an element of community empowerment and of making sure bidirectionally the messages going in and the messages coming out, the learnings coming out, that the community is in dialogue and that they're not just actively participating in the dialogue, they are driving the dialogue.
Yeah.
There's a whole thing in the activist community of like, don't be the voice of the people, just pass the mic.
Right. I love that. I love that. Yes. And there's such humility needed for that to happen because when we know something, we want to share it.
Yes.
And to step aside and to give the microphone to somebody else and let them get the quote credit for delivering the message. you really need to care more about the issue and the cause and the change than you do about getting the credit for it yourself.
Yes, that is absolutely right.
What are some of the biggest lessons that you took away from your work with Interrupt the Violence? So these are the things that you learned yourself that you will apply in all of the work that you're going to do in the future with other organizations.
Oh my God, Curtis, so much, so much. And let me tell you, first of all, like our entire disruptive story mapping concept comes out of this work.
Wow.
And this is part of this marriage, right, between the community engagement mindset that Cobe has and that ITV promotes, and the traditional communications marketing approach that I was taking. And when you bring those together, you get a much more nuanced picture of the messaging that you're trying to get across and the fully realized human being across from you that you're trying to work with. And if I had to distill it down, I would say the main thing is listen. Make sure that you're doing more listening than you are talking, and that you also suspend any preconceived notions. Even if this is an audience you've been working with for decades, check that at the door. Go in with as much as you can suspend your preconceived notions and just listen and experience with fresh eyes and ears. We want to be able to figure out what those barriers to adopting that change is going to be in the first place. And then what are the ways that we can navigate around that or incentivize the adoption of it or address or assuage any fears going into that change. And so that's where bringing in an outside consultant is helpful to sort of mediate these conversations.
I want to give listeners something they can actually do to start this process of improving their narrative framework, better engaging their supporters, making a bigger impact in the community, without giving away the recipe to your secret sauce. What are one or two things that somebody who's listening right now who's like, this sounds great, that they can, take to their team or to their leadership or whoever it is and, really start this process within their organization?
The first thing I'll say is that the biggest mistake I've seen organizations make across the board is to put themselves in the protagonist role. And so a very typical, for example, nonprofit or even, health and hospital system story is here is patient X suffering from such and such. And then they encountered our organization and we have a miraculous surgical team, or we have, a fantastic clinical team. And based on their interaction with us and their intervention, they solved their problem. And so that's a very, very typical, when we talk about story mapping, that's a very typical template of most organizations. That's most nonprofit, copywriters are like, or communicators are like, oh yeah, I've written that story. Yeah, I know I have written hundreds of those stories, right? But I think part of the shift of like the time period we're in, the zeitgeist that we're in right now, and overall doing right by the work is to make yourself just a participating character. Don't make the entire story about your organization. Make the entire story about the change itself, the impact that you're trying to make. That's one takeaway that I think your listeners can, when they're finished here, look at some of their materials, do their own sort of communications audit or messaging audit and say, are we trying to make ourselves the hero in every instance?
Right. And I have written those letters too. I'm with you. Not to put you on the spot, Josh, but can you give an example of how an organization might present themselves in a way that, doesn't cast them as the hero, but still makes the point that they're making an impact for the people that they serve?
So I promote strategy first. There are other ways of saying, this is how we change lives than just overtly saying. It's kind of like the creative writing adage of like, show, don't tell, right? Mm. So it helps to recognize the autonomy and the agency of your clients, your customers, patients, or participants, whatever, and to celebrate that. And the people will get that you influence that outcome. Mm. So a formerly incarcerated individual who's returning to the community, or a substance user who is now kind of challenging their addiction and entering into recovery. So putting yourself in the mindset that this is ultimately their story and not a vehicle for you to promote your story. Mm. The second is to humanize your protagonist. So making sure that they are seen as something more than the issues that they struggle with or the services that they seek, and that they're not just a placeholder for you to deploy your services on them. And then the third is to use data to drive the story. Mm. And then just a quick caveat, Curtis, that I would also say consent is like actually absolutely imperative, like making sure that you're checking in with the client or the participant or whomever story you're sharing on your behalf. There's a project that was promoting sort of nutritional guidelines for food banks and food pantries. So we identified our strategy first. It was to promote that the guidelines existed and showcase a bit of what those guidelines featured, and then make sure that the agency was seen as an expert on the issue. We could have approached it in a number of ways. The traditional way is sort of like the agency created, these guidelines working with these experts and meeting these needs and so on. Or you could start with one of the experts and kind of work your way back to some of the expertise that's in the guide. Where we actually started was we started with a beneficiary from the food bank, a returning Iraq war vet who had fallen on hard times, was contending with some mental health issues, was precariously housed, and honestly was subsisting off of like cereal and peanut butter 3 times a day. And so we told his story and made him kind of the centerpiece of the story. The organization in this roughly like 2,000 word piece was mentioned, I want to say it was mentioned twice. Once just introducing the guidelines, and once when the executive director was quoted. Of course, it was branded. The logo was on there. There was contact information and other additional pieces. But, the main focus was on that individual who was just trying to get by and could benefit from the services that were being provided in these guidelines. Mm. And this wasn't an appeal, mind you, but we heard from donors that this was one of the best pieces that the organization had produced because it really showcased the work. And it really comes down to, I think, trusting your audience and saying, okay, we trust you. You're going to recognize our role in this, but we're just going to tell you what happened. And you can connect the dots on your own. Otherwise, we sound like that guy at the party that can't stop, bragging and telling everyone how awesome he is. And we don't want to be that guy.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely do not be that guy. Thank you, Josh, for being so generous today, sharing your experience and advice. Any final takeaways for listeners before I let you go?
Sure. I think the meta thing that I would like folks to take away is just the importance and the value of storytelling. Mm-hmm. But more than that, Curtis, is the importance and the value of effective storytelling, of strategic storytelling. Mm-hmm. There's a line by the poet Bukowski where, as God said, crossing her legs, I see where I have made many, many poets, but not so very much poetry. And I think that's very true of the period that we're in right now with story. I feel like we're in a time where everybody knows story is important, and there's storytellers everywhere. Everybody's a storyteller, but there's not very many effective stories that are out there.
True. Very true. And people like you and Cobe are working hard to change that. That wraps up our conversation about breaking down barriers to change. Thank you, Josh Gryniewicz, and thanks to Ricardo Cobe Williams for sharing your insights and expertise. If you'd like to learn more about our panel members, we'll include that information in the show notes. We will also provide links to the nonprofit organizations referenced during the show. If you like this episode, we would love your help spreading the word. First, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app so you always know when a new episode is released. Second, forward the episodes you like to friends and colleagues or share them on social media. Word of mouth is one of the best ways you can help us reach more nonprofit professionals like yourself. And if you're an Apple Podcast listener, please leave us a review. Positive reviews are how many listeners decide whether or not to try out a new podcast. We appreciate your help. For back episodes and more resources like white papers, infographics, and blog articles, please visit the free IPM Advancement Nonprofit Resource Library at ipmadvancement.com/resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.